Carl asked if we wanted an introduction, and we'll forego that because it would probably be impossible in one introduction to include things that are both favorable and true. So we'll forego the introduction.
Not so.
Our focus today is going to be Paul on trial, the unfolding courtroom drama. Today it's a multi-scene courtroom drama, as a matter of fact. Paul is defending himself against baseless charges brought by the Jewish establishment. Paul's difficulties actually began last week.
Do you want to be sharing this screen now?
Yes, we need to.
Go ahead. Sorry. You can keep talking, Jack.
Help is on the way, have no fear.
You can see that?
Yes.
Paul's difficulties actually began in last week's episode when he was seized by Asian Jews in the temple and who accused him of defiling the temple. And as our drama opens this week, Paul is before the Sanhedrin, a group of 72 officials who exercise religious, civil, and minor criminal jurisdiction. Serious matters and those demanding the death penalty would have to be referred to the Roman judiciary. Chapters 23 through 25 feature judicial proceedings in Jerusalem, at the Sanhedrin, Caesarea, seat of the Roman provincial governor, Antonius Felix, and also King Agrippa, who was visiting in Caesarea at the time. In next week's episode, Paul goes to Rome to await a hearing, which he requested be before the imperial tribunal. Don't know if that hearing was ever held, first of all. And secondly, it's doubtful if it was, that the hearing was before the emperor, which is what Paul requested. The volume of hearings that were requested and given at this time was very large, and they would typically be done by other magistrates, not the emperor. The emperor himself at this time was Nero, who would probably be in his absolute declining phase. And the picture that you're seeing before you on your screen actually is one of an orator making an appeal, and it might have been to Agrippa and Festus and Drusilla if we wanted to localize this to the episode that we're considering today. Now, there's a great deal of action in these chapters, and compared to others, not really all that much. There are numerous key figures, however, the Greek Jews that are responsible for the conflict moving forward. The Sanhedrin, the Roman tribune, many soldiers, Ananias, Tertullus, the prosecutor for the temple authorities, Felix, the Roman procurator, the minor magistrate, Festus Felix's successor, and Agrippa II, the last Herodian king. And that's just the beginning. We can figure out the number of others if we wanted to. But in these chapters, Luke's historical account of the first 30 years of the church history is moving to its close. And in Acts, the story has moved from a promise by the ascending Christ, as Acts opens. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Paul is an inheritor of that promise, and he in fact has made much of it into reality, along with others, such as Luke. Time permitting today, we're going to consider three significant sections of these chapters: Acts 23, verses 1 through 10, Acts 24, verses 10 through 21, Acts 25, verses 4 through 12. We'll put the material up on the screen, and we'll also have paper handouts for any of you who like. As we consider these passages, we'll be answering at least 3 questions and then perhaps some add-ons. First, what happens in this scene? Second, what's Paul trying to accomplish? And then third, how did the events of this scene move the story forward? Fran?
Jack. Fran, go ahead and click on admit there.
So that covered a wide swath of information about the schedule of Paul's movements. And so remembering where we're starting here, Paul has been called before the Sanhedrin, which and this translation is called the council. So this is what's happening at this point. So there's a bit of reading. I'm going to suggest that we try reading it out loud. And then for other readings, we'll see whether or how it would work. So with someone who is on Zoom, read verses 1 through 5 for us.
I will. Let's see. Yes, I'm unmuted. Okay. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest Ananias, just as an aside, this is the third Ananias we have had, the one who held back the proceeds with his wife Sapphira back in chapter 5, the Ananias who rescued Paul after he was blinded in chapter 9, and this one a judge. Anyway, then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law, you ordered me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare insult the God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of the leader of your people."
Would somebody else who's on Zoom read the text, please? Somebody on mute trying to read. I'll go ahead and read it then. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out to the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, or angel, or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees' group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him to the barracks. Sorry. All right, so as Jack said, we want to answer a few questions about this text. The first one is, what happens, just this facts, what happened in this scene?
Well, it looks to me like Paul's just trying to get out with his skin.
Barry says Paul's just trying to get out with his skin. Can those of you online hear him?
Yes, heard Harry. That was Harry, I think.
Perfect, okay, keep going. Sorry.
It's odd that he doesn't know who the high priest is. That seems incongruent. But I don't understand how he insulted him by what he said to start with. I mean, he's obviously trying to be persuasive, but I don't see any insult in what he said. Especially since they, just smacked him in the mouth.
But he is on trial, so he could have been trying not to make any more enemies. I don't know. Maybe that's why he immediately refers to what the law was. Because I agree with you, it's not that he said anything that's highly fitting, but if he was already put on trial and already being criticized and accused of a lot of different things, maybe he was trying to like take that one off the list. I thought.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
Dialogue about identity. Who's the priest and who's Paul?
All he said to make them angry was, I did the best I could in my life. Smack him in the mouth. I don't have any problem believing that he was in great contention with them. And that even if it was a high insult, he probably had a pretty good justification for making it.
This was a tactic on the part of the Sanhedrin. It worked. Smacked him in the mouth, and then he reacted. So you whitewashed wall. Given them information.
That kind of slides into the next question. What's Paul trying to accomplish? In the entire scene.
I think what Harry started out with, begin with, is what he's trying to get out by the skin of his teeth. He's trying to get out of trouble, but at the same time share God's word.
Well, it's clever. He's trying to get the Sadducees and the Pharisees at each other's throats. So he's setting up the scene and getting the tension going and building it and adding to the drama here. And that's his plan, I think, is to try to get these two factions of the Jewish faith arguing with each other about resurrection and going on with that's what he's trying to do, is if he can get them arguing, then he can present his idea and about the resurrection and then move on. And hopefully they will continue to be in contention with one another.
Paul foments the controversy, which is designed to direct attention away from Paul to the disagreement amongst the Sanhedrin for a while, except that it ends up becoming so heated that in the next segment, Paul's going to get himself arrested.
Kind of leads us to how the events are moving the story forward. Go to the next text, this is another long one.
Had one other point I wanted to add, and I noticed in what you had us read, you didn't include verse 11. And that had been by design, but for me, that kind of sticks out where after Paul at the council, then the narrator says, that night the Lord stood near him and said, keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome. And for me, that's kind of a big part of that whole scene, that after he's gone through all this with the council, and he gets encouragement from God as you're moving, as the story moves forward.
Oh, good point. Were those of you who are remote able to hear Lynn? I'm off mute and. No,
I'm on the back row. So.
it's on the back row. Just to make it clear, Lynn asked suggested that perhaps the answer was in verse 11, which is that night the Lord stood near him and said, keep up your courage, just as you've testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome. So indeed, that is a nice summary of where things are going.
I think it's interesting too that he uses the word brothers. And he's trying to make sure that he recognized as being a good faith Jew, making that connection very strongly in those two. I'm part of the whole clan, the tribe. I think that's an important thing that he says. He's still trying to make his point up.
Did everybody hear that? Now we see their faces. Did they hear now?
Well,
Were you able to hear now?
yeah.
Yes, thumbs up,
Okay.
okay. Yeah, we can't, in the room, it's hard to see both the slides and the people that are in the Zoom meeting, so if you will help me out by speaking up.
They need to summarize the responses.
They said they heard.
I think they're hearing them, that's what we're missing the confirmation from the Zoom participants that you're hearing, so.
I'm hearing, but not very well. Just
Okay,
need more volume.
okay, then I'll have to repeat because we've got the volume where it can go. The next set, so you gotta click on. The next set that we're gonna look at
Look at mine.
is Acts 24:10-21. Somebody, Barbara, would you read 10-15, please?
Starting at verse 10.
10-15, please.
Then Paul, if you don't mind, I'm going to read from my Bible because the screen isn't clear. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship, and then neither found me in the temple, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they can accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been there before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. Unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. But when, let's see.
So that text was about as radically different from the one that we have as I can imagine. So those who are in the room will be seeing, and those of you who see the screen will see a somewhat different text. But what happens in this scene?
Somebody said a minute ago that Paul was what propels the action? God's plan propels the action, evidently, because everything that went on in 23 was done to set up what comes on in 24, which is to advance. And it seems to be less passion here. And I'm wondering if that doesn't have something to do with the fact that it's an appeal. When you watch Law and Order and you see all these fired up arguments, when they get into the appellate court, it's all calm and gentlemanly. And maybe it's less passionate here because it's an appeal court.
Right, that's a brilliant observation. I've never heard that posited, but it makes a lot of sense, yeah. And plus he keeps telling, he gets to practice more and more because he keeps saying the same thing, right?
Yeah.
My memory's a little fuzzy on precisely the question that Christian closed out chapter 22 with, but I remember if there had been more time, my answer was going to be Paul was once a Pharisee, always a Pharisee. And I think we're seeing that again and again in these texts, that he's holding up his credentials as a card-carrying member. Why are you upset with me?
Just to add to that, Paul, we use the word conversion often to describe the Damascus Road experience. And Paul is going to retell it even one more time. He's told it in chapter 22 as well as reading it in chapter 9. But Paul never thinks of himself as being a convert. He did not convert from Judaism to Christianity, and indeed that kind of language is not used in Acts at all. Former dean of Harvard Divinity School and Bishop of Sweden, whose name is slipping me at the moment, wrote a wonderful article with a title like something like Paul and the introspective conscience of the West, in which he contended that the Damascus Road experience is better understood as a call, like the call of the prophets in the Old Testament, and that Paul is being called to be the apostle to the Gentiles. But Paul always affirms his Jewishness, his fealty to the law. Gentiles don't need to follow the Torah, but Paul is not a Gentile, and he does, and he knows the law, and he knows how to use it to his advantage in these trial scenes. And in this trial scene, as we've noted, he takes this major division between the Sadducees and the Pharisees over the question of the resurrection of the dead, and aligns himself fully with the Pharisees. And Paul was a Pharisee, is a Pharisee as long as he lives, but he happens to be a Pharisee who believes that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Lord.
Thanks, Christian. So how do these events move the story forward?
Paul moves him forward himself when he says, I'm a citizen, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't mess with me. And then the guy says, well, this would be over, except you claim to be a Roman citizen. So now you're going to Rome for trial again. So I guess since maybe Paul was winning the argument, if it's an advance of God's plan, then he had to put in a little confusion in Paul's mind, so Paul would trip himself up and keep the story going.
Well, you're an advanced student too, and you're anticipating the next scene.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's good. That's good. All good. So, Harry, since they can hear you, would you like to read? The whole thing?
Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him. After he'd stayed among them for not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the emperor. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges? Paul said, I'm appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I should be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, if I'm in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I'm not trying to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor. Then Festus, after he had conferred with his council, replied, you have appealed to the emperor, to the emperor you will go.
Right. First, just a teaser for next week. Bruce will be teaching next week on chapters 26 and 27, so he will get to pick up with you have appealed to the emperor, and to the emperor you will go. And he's also preaching on Acts 27 this morning, so during the services we can watch for spoiler alerts for next week. Okay, so back to our questions here. So just a summary. What happened?
Paul is continuing to be accused, but he's also continuing to defend himself. And so, this time he appealed to the emperor, which that probably saved his life at this point, because the people in Jerusalem were planning to kill him. But it's another scene with him trying, I guess, different form of defense. He's gone through different stages of defense, and this time he's close to the emperor.
So those are kind of the events. And what's he trying to accomplish then?
I'm just back to, it's not Paul trying to accomplish anything, it's God advancing the plan. To get him to Rome for his own purposes, and Paul's an instrument.
An excellent new framing.
Could you restate that, please?
Can you hear now?
Yes.
That it wasn't really Paul trying to accomplish anything, but that it was God trying to accomplish something through Paul, and that something was to get him to Rome for God's own purpose. Paul's the instrument, not Paul's accomplishment.
Thank you.
Very, very profound. Thank you. And so the events in this scene are moving the story forward in what way?
They're literally changing the locus of the story. Paul wants to change the locus to Rome. In other words, when that happens, in the course of 30 years, the church has moved from a hill in Jerusalem to the seat of the empire.
Were you able to hear Jack?
No.
Jack says in 30 years, the locus of the church,
Presence of the church.
the
has
presence of
moved
the
from
church.
The hill in Jerusalem to the seat of the entire worldwide empire.
From a hill in Jerusalem to the seat of a worldwide empire. That's what's happened in moving the story forward. Right. Well, taking into account all three of the texts, what these texts tell us about Paul?
Well, I think the text affirm Paul's Jewishness. I guess he is in a sense multicultural in that he is also a Roman city, which he's a Roman citizen. He gained that citizenship from birth. But it's curious that he never brings it out until now. But it's and he's going to have to spend a couple of some scholars have wondered whether Paul would have been better just to leave things in the hands of Felix and Festus, or Festus particularly in this one, and he might have been released, but as it is, he's going to have to spend more time in prison before they can get him to Rome. And then I guess the other thing to mention that I think when way back when at the beginning, I think we mentioned that this was sort of and you, Fran, I think you said this too, that one of Luke's things is to move the story of Christianity from the capital of Judaism, Jerusalem, to the capital of the whole Roman Empire, Rome, and that sort of it's a back and forth movement from tracing the maps of Paul's journeys, but he will finally get to Rome.
Harry said before a Christian that he was certainly, another thing about Paul is said he was persistent. What else? Anything else?
A good lawyer.
A good lawyer.
Yeah.
Presenting the case, delivering here and there and making his point. Trying to move his argument along and trying to save his skin.
And a good debater.
Yeah. Good debater.
Uses a lot of the skill set of a debater. What do these texts tell us about God?
I think this builds a lot on what Harry was saying, that this is really a story about God. And Paul is kind of in the spotlight in that he keeps getting
Could you
these,
speak up a bit?
he keeps getting these near-death experiences. And he's snatched away at the last minute. There's a series of circumstances that conspire to allow him to move on to the next thing, but he keeps going through these things over and over, and God keeps plucking him away and moving him closer to his ultimate goal. And it's reminiscent of a lot of these movies where, you know, someone is in the throes of death and they're miraculously saved over and over and over and over again, because the circumstances just seem really sensational to me. In that everything aligns to save him each time, and it's quite miraculous, which there's only one explanation for that miraculous occurrence, and that's God.
The danger is jumping way ahead, but at this point, God's making a position, trying to get his people in a position to confront the power of Rome, which he ultimately defeats a few centuries later.
I wanted to say something about Acts 23:11, when Paul was in prison after appearing before the Sanhedrin. God appears to him and he says, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify me in Rome." I think that's God's message. It's what Paul needs to be doing, and Paul's very intense about doing it. But that seemed to be his direction. And he,
And did you have something?
I was just gonna say, back on your question about what does it tell us about Paul?
Can you speak up a bit?
Back on your question about what does this say about Paul, I was thinking in the chapters before, I think when Christian covered this, and maybe even Laura Catherine before, how people were telling him, don't go to Jerusalem. It's dangerous, don't go to Jerusalem. But he was focused on what his goals should be. So Harry mentioned his persistence, led by the Spirit. So notwithstanding what other people told him not to go to Jerusalem, it was because he had to go through Jerusalem to get to Rome, and he was willing to suffer. I mean, I put myself in his situation, going before all these councils, dealing with the Roman Empire. Would I want to go? Would I be willing to struggle and to struggle for the faith in that way? And so that's what struck me about when you talk about what does this tell us about Paul?
Were you able to hear Lynn?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Yes, Laura Catherine.
I'll try to yell. I also just like how the verses that you selected, God is in the discussion, but he's not featured. And it just makes me think how, God is in all the details of our lives. He's in the courtroom, he's at home, he's on the streets with us, and just his presence is there, and he's always at work. Because this, to me, when I'm reading these verses, I'm like, it's a courtroom drama. It feels like something that you'd see on TV, or something that plays out in real life. And it's like, yeah, God is in that. He's working in that.
God is in it from the beginning and throughout. Great. So one final question about these three texts. How could we take the message of these texts into our lives, or what is the impact of this for us?
Big thanks that Paul did it, and you don't have to. I know.
Giving thanks to all the, and we.
But think about what Lynn said, but what Lynn said, you know, and how bold Paul was and how brave he was. And what would I do in that same situation? And I'm glad that he did it, and hopefully I don't have to, but what I hope to take from it is that whatever situation I'm put in, that I will stand firm and that I will not waver.
I see it as a message of perseverance. Stay the course, and the Holy Spirit will be with you and guide you. Never give up. There are going to be many obstacles that are put in your path, but God's ultimate will be done.
Whether you like it or not.
I think too, that a sermon a few weeks back, I'm sorry, I don't have the name, but the reminder that, you know, Paul was he was listening to God's voice, and in spite of what other people said and what all, and the point, it was a sermon about the voice of God, you may remember, and the conclusion or the summary was that God's voice is always a surprise, a delightful surprise. And so to claim that it doesn't always seem delightful at the time, but to claim the promise that the end result, God's voice, God's leading is for the good, for the plan, for God's plan.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all, Jack.
Let's pray together. Loving God, we thank you for consistently call to us. Call to reach to hear your voice. Move forward in faith. Your son's name.
We'll tune in next week for Bruce and chapters 26 and 27. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.